I'm delighted to welcome Professor Alexander Regier, the first speaker of Global Blakes in Conversation series in 2024. The title of today's paper is Printing Blake in Texas. Alexander Regier is William Faulkner Professor of English and Chair of the English Department at Rice University. He also holds a full appointment in the Department of Modern and Classical Literatures and Cultures. In recent years, he has held fellowships at the National Humanities Center, that's in 2023, and a research award from the NEH, the National Endowment for the Humanities, also in 2023, and the Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship for Experienced Researchers, and that was from 2018 to 2020. Regier has published widely on Blake. He's the author of the monographs Exorbitant Enlightenment, Blake Harmon, and Anglo-German Constellations, Oxford University Press 2018, and Fracture and Fragmentation in British Romanticism, Cambridge University Press 2010. His Awkwardness, The History and Art of Unease is under review. He has co-edited Wordsworth's Poetic Theory, Palgrave 2010, as well as special issues on mobilities and genealogies. Regier is also the co-editor of the Bloomsbury Handbook on Sports Writing, 1789 to 2020, which is under contract. Alexander will talk and introduce the press, the history and use of the replica Star Wheel Blake press, and as we will see, he will tell the story of how the press ended up in Houston, Texas. In the conversation part of today's event, Alexander will answer questions, which, as I said previously, you can type into the chat at any point if you do not wish to be seen, because we're recording the whole event. And the questions can relate to the history, use, and the story of the replica of William Blake's press. I hand over to you, Alexander.
Thank you so much, Sibyl, and thank you, Jason. Thank you all for attending and dialing in. I know it's a busy time, so I really, really appreciate it. As Sibyl said, this will be more of an informal sort of talk and presentation, telling a story. And I should say that I told Sibyl and Jason also, and I should thank them again for inviting me, even though I told them that this might not be a straightforward paper with a with the type of argument that I normally ask students and myself to produce. But it's a different kind of way of maybe presenting and thinking through material. And I hope that we can sort of develop and do this in the question and answer period. So let me start with something that is maybe a little odd, but hopefully nevertheless relevant. It's a raffle, and it's basically the beginning of the story. Is an odd personal story, how the Blake Press came to be in Houston, Texas. And I never win raffles, right? Never, ever, ever do, ever. And then there was in 2016, there was a giveaway run by the Blake Quarterly, actually. And what was offered was one of Michael Phillips' reproduction prints from the Songs of Innocence and of Experience. And the only thing one needed to really do was to send in an email reply with one's name. And so I thought, well, you know, bad track record, we can extend that. But what happened to my extraordinary, and to my surprise, was something extraordinary, that in October 2016, I received an email from Sarah Jones that I had in fact won this raffle, and as a result was in touch with Michael Phillips, who very kindly sent me a print, and then proved to be an interlocutor and ultimately a good friend for the next decade. And that is where the story comes back to the press. I had obviously already known Michael and his work. I was knee deep in, the book that Sibylla mentioned earlier, kindly, Exorbitant Enlightenment, which was about the connections between Blake and Hamann and the Anglo-German sort of network that happened, that was in existence before the 1790s. I was aware of Michael's work and the kind of work that obviously Michael was producing. I hadn't really considered Blake in a way that would link it to the wider avenues that I hope to explore sort of today. And that is in relation to a form of material culture and an attention to the haptic that turned out to be very, very important, not just in the way in which one can, and we all can read Blake and we can understand Blake, but also the way in which we might want to consider and think about and think through again how we can think about Blake as a global figure, but at the same time that is a figure who is very, very, very much located in a geographic location and a present. Okay, so let me just start with something that happened, in fact, 2 weeks ago, and I'd start with a little clip, and where you can see how the press is used as a teaching and as a research tool here at Rice. I've used the press in undergraduate and graduate classes, as you'll see. But I just want to give you a very short snippet of an instance to just give you a flavor of this. What you're about to see really only happened about 3 weeks ago. And then I'll say a little bit more and comment through about this. So, and I'll have to find my spot, yeah. Which thankfully, I won't have you suffer through the whole thing. Don't worry. But I think this gives you a good idea as to what's at stake.
The students first create their own colors using period-correct dry pigment mixed with linseed oil.
We ink them, we dab the ink onto what's called a dauber, and then we pick up the plate that we're going to work with and we pat it on to the plate.
It's a tedious process, one that requires precision. Once the plate, another Michael Phillips recreation, is thinly but completely coated, it's ready for the press.
Learning and seeing how that is done in a different age, and then also recreating it under the conditions, how hard it was and how difficult, but also how beautiful it can be and how joyful it can be. I think those are some of the reasons that this makes it an exciting kind of process.
Everybody's got their way of interacting with it, and it's just fun because everybody gets something different out of it. But people's faces when they come over and they see their image on their piece of paper from the plate that they inked. It's just delightful.
Amanda?
So, just to comment on this, you got a sense of how rich and how much potential there is in the press and the way that it is used. I should say that what was displayed here isn't something that was necessarily exceptional since the press came here in last year, and I'll talk a little bit about the history in a second, how that came to be. This was a class that happened 3 weeks ago. As I said, I taught a class last semester, a graduate class on the labor of reading, and you can easily see how the issue of labor is crucial here. Well, Michael Phillips was also attending, and this was the time when we put the press together. But the press has been used in at least 15 separate classes across campus since its arrival. So it's a tool that's really been used very, very frequently in relation to Blake, of course, and that is what interests this audience in particular, but also in ways in which this might actually be something where we can talk about later on too, how the study of Blake in that way actually opens up avenues on, to the history of and the study of, material culture, that are quite different from the way in which, that is only linked to this particular author. Now, of course, the question is, how did we get here? How did this tool actually, and how did this machine, this amazing piece, come to be in Houston and be used by the students here? And so some of you will know some of the story, of course, already, but let me just remind you, oops, sorry, wrong way around. Apologies. There we go. So the press was built in 2014 for an exhibition in the Ashmolean, William Blake Apprentice and Master. Many of you will have seen this. Michael Phillips curated it, and the experience of standing in that room, where the small room, the printing room, of course, Blake's studio was recreated for that, and the press for that too, was a very transformative experience for many scholars, I think. And after the exhibit, the press itself came to be stored at Christ Church, which you can also see here. And that is actually where I encountered the press first. In 2017, when I visited Michael Phillips, and we used the press together. We had it was an extraordinary day. I was on sabbatical actually in Cambridge, and went over to Oxford, and we spent the day together printing. I can really recommend, I don't want to, Michael has spoken and written about this in far greater and more knowledgeable detail than I have, but I can recommend a short article in the Christchurch newsletter about it from 2016, I believe, how the press was in fact built, how the dimensions were calculated, the retrieval of the particular wood, how the very materials that the carpenters were to use were selected, and what actually an incredibly laborious and difficult process that was. And here I just want to give a sense of how this can really transform the way in which we understand Blake, even as people who are not absolutely hardcore material culture people, and I'll count myself in that. I'm not an expert in the way that many of you in this room will be. But for instance, when the press came to Houston and we reassembled it, there was a moment where we had to grease the wheel of the press. And it turned out that the thing that greases the wheels, and that's period, correct, is lamb's fat. And that, to me, the moment I saw that, and in fact that somebody had brought across the ocean a piece of lamb's fat, and had been with the press to make the wheels within wheels, right? Greasing the wheels within wheels that were made by, say, the animal that would be the savior himself. That really changed the way I would read Blake in all sorts of ways, right? So it's just a little example that, for me at least, was very powerful. There might be others for those who've used the press in different ways, but I think that it just shows a very, very clear sense of how even such a small detail can really be a powerful springboard for a new way of approaching and opening up hermeneutically the poetry and the art that Blake confronts us with. So to continue the story, 5 years later, the Blake press moves. And the way this happened was also rather peculiar. Michael Phillips and I had stayed in contact and were connected through colleagues and through work and so on and so forth. However, what put this particular thing really in motion and explains why it started to move from Christchurch, Oxford to Houston, Texas, was an email from Michael in October 2022, where he explained that Christchurch had asked him to move the press and that it was looking for a new home. And maybe I should just give Michael, who has been so central to this, also the chance to explain this in person via video. So let me show you another quick clip.
I'm very.
Oops.
With Alexander, he got in touch with me and wanted to see the press, and I welcomed the idea of his having a chance to meet me in Oxford, where it was on loan in Christchurch Upper Library. And there we spent the day together printing on it, and he was enthralled by it. And then when the occasion arose about 6 or 8 months ago, that Christchurch no longer had space for the press and wanted it removed, Alexander was one of the first, not the first person that I wrote to say, I don't know if this would be of interest, but I've got to find a new home for the press. And he said, give me 24 hours.
Done.
So this is then this is a little over a year ago. And what happened then, I, of course, started to scramble around and it was an extraordinary opportunity. And that's why I want to mention a few other people that made it possible.
Only one there is.
To happen. Because what, of course, had to happen was very quickly to raise the funds and to really just confront the logistics. And so this was a really extraordinary group effort, apart from Michael. Sarah Lohman, who's the head librarian here and the vice provost, Amanda Foki, the head of special collections, and Joe Goetz, the subject librarian for English, really got together, and with the help of the Fondren's Hobby Family Fund, which comes from the Hobby Foundation and the Hobby family, big Texas oil family, and the Friends of Fondren Library, we were able to, put together a plan that allowed to disassemble the press in Oxford, create it, and then ship it over here, and then reassemble it, and invite Michael Phillips to come over and together to put the press together, and again, and really install it here as a permanent feature in the library for scholars and students and staff. And we don't really like talking about this kind of thing, I believe, in our neck of the woods quite often, in the academic neck of the woods, but it matters a great deal. And I found this out in a different way, in a global context and also a local one. Since these are funding structures that really impact the way in which we create and we can produce knowledge, and that really goes much further than a simple juxtaposition between, say, the UK or the US. And again, this is something that we can talk about later, but I think it's really an important part of it, of this story, because it's a question also, the story of the press is also a question of funds and time and money and imagination, right? The original plan was to have this press to be in Feltham in the Blake Cottage. And this is a complex question, right? And any simplification of it would really be dangerous, I think. But what is even more dangerous is not to engage with this aspect of the way in which these kinds of things come to pass, because it takes dedication and effort and time, which is something that all of these people that you can see on the screen really talked a lot about and invested a lot of to make this possible. So again, since we're talking about the realities of it, this is what it looked like when it was created and shipped. It meant to build custom-made crates, which happened on the Oxford side, disassemble the press, and then reassemble it with precise instructions from the carpenters. And as you'll see here in this little collage, this was quite an intricate process, and it was almost flawless, but we got there in the end. So this would be a before and after picture of the place where the press is now. That is the Woodson Research Center. Those of you who are local will recognize it. Those of you who will come and visit, hopefully, because the press is, of course, open to all, might be able to experience this when you're here. So what is really extraordinary, I think, as one part of the story, is how quickly this, or how all of this happened. So this is a quick timeline. The speed with which this happened is really extraordinary. This was the initial email from Michael. We met a couple of weeks later, and then we secured the funding, and this is, I think, the key, very, very quickly, which then meant, and we were under some pressure because the Christchurch really wanted that the press out. It got created and shipped a month after we had everything secured. It had its voyage across the ocean. The voyage came to an end in February 23. When it arrived at the port, it cleared customs and it was delivered to Faulkner, which that turned out to be a logistically more challenging thing than many other things, bizarrely. And on the 27th of February, it was assembled. You saw those pictures, and 3 days later, it was unveiled and to the public and to the Friends of Fondren. The Blake press now is in use, as I told you, and as I showed you earlier, by faculty, of course, by undergraduates and graduates alike. They're the first budding ideas of maybe even PhD projects involving this press too. Visiting scholars, staff who've been really, really interested in this too, community members, and actually, if you look at the QR code, that's why I put it in there, there's a whole open printing studio that this press started, in some way, a process that this press started, that Fondren is doing, the library is doing, who have now acquired different kinds of presses and actually have started to work with the printing museum together and so on and so forth. So the knock-on effects of this, just quite outside of the way in which, what we would normally think of as a tight Blake community, have been really quite remarkable. Before we, open, for question and Q&A, and as I told Sybil, there'll be plenty of questions I won't be able to answer. So, please forgive me for that already. But there are really theoretical and practical dimensions of this that I would just like to point towards it, because I think that they're really rather key. And some of them are to do with the way in which, of course, as we talked about earlier, this is a very, very clear way in which we can not just study theoretically in the classroom the importance of the haptic, but really bring it home to the way in which we study not just Blake, but especially Blake. Given that the library also acquired the plates, the recreated plates, that of course makes this much, much easier. But there are other projects also afoot to actually create other plates, not Blake related. So the importance of the haptic that we sort of talk about a lot, but then actually not many of us are able to do and to perform in our own classrooms. That is something to have that on campus and to have it very, very close by, and to have the institution be open to that, and the library and the research center, the archives, to be open to the welcoming of outsiders to actually experience that and not just talk about it theoretically is very, very important. But then also, I think what the haptic, or what the very concrete experience of a machine like that and working with it and the labor that involves, both from the physical aspect but also the intellectual aspect, opens up, is something that is much more theoretical almost. That's a really new consideration of how students or scholars can think about the archive, and how that is a way in which a machine like precisely the press can influence the way in which we think about the archival. Just to give you an example of what I mean by that, I think one of my one of the graduate students here said it very well. And so let him. And actually, this is completely unprompted. We had not spoken about this at all in class.
Specifically, I mean, for Blake scholarship, it's a huge deal. The kind of proximity that you can have with the kind of text that Blake would have actually been working with is massively increased. But then just in a more theoretical sense, this is like just changes your perspective on the archive. It acts like a drastically expanded archive, because this is not just an artifactual archive or a text, but rather, it's a kind of an archived process.
Hello.
So this seems to me important, that this is a way in which it opens up a way of thinking these kinds of considerations for students, but also for us, of course, as scholars, or as whoever is using the press, that help us become much, much better readers of Blake. So I just want to mention one or two, actually three, upcoming projects and collaborations that I think would be useful to sort of illustrate the variety of bodies apart from students and scholars that this speaks to, and that is, and I think one of I think John is actually in attendance. So and so is Thora, with whom I'm maybe thinking about putting together an application for an NEH summer seminar around the press, and how we could house this here as a printing workshop. She will know much more about this. Maybe we can talk about this in the Q&A too. But John Riordan, who's also present, I believe, is coming to visit to print in April next month. So a way in which this press, the Blake press, also is producing something that is not just a reproduction of art, of course, but new art, and new ways of thinking through how these machines can create and be creators themselves too. And then something much more, we talk about interdisciplinarity a lot within the humanities, but the engineers were all over it certainly, and wanted to print their own in get 3D printers involved, have student projects, and get to print their own plates that they can then use to think through a different kind of printing. Obviously a rolling press that doesn't exist in those is not something that is standard anymore. So it allows us, and this, I put those 3 images up because, you know, how different could you be, that to see how broad the appeal really is, and how rich this machine as a connecting item can be across not just the campus or, you know, different forms of in the humanities, but also across different ways of thinking through the kind of artistic production that we like to engage with. So I guess the moral of the story is enter the raffle, and more importantly, believe in the connections that bodies like the Blake Society or the Global Blake Network make possible. And as Sibylla and I and many others here have been at pains to point out in a lot of ways, Blake isn't just Albion's poet, of course, and the fact that this story spans geographies and generations is a proof of that. So with that, I shall stop and maybe give a chance for more of a conversation, if that's all right, Sibyl.
Wow. I mean, the speed with which you got the machine from Oxford to Euston is unbelievable. I mean, I hadn't been aware of the timeline, swiftness, and one can only imagine what the obstacles will have been. Wonderful. Okay. If you have a question, you can raise your hand with the reaction button or type your question into the chat. So that's all there. So while we give people a moment to think, so you can then also switch on your camera and speak and ask Alexander directly. Okay, while people are thinking, so before we move on to think, oh, there is some, Gareth, no, people are coming. Is there any one of you who I can see who would like to ask a question? Gareth.
Hello, and thank you very much for just a delightful presentation. They're really fascinating. I've always had it in my mind that these presses required quite a lot of force to use to turn that starry wheel, but looking at the pictures and the videos, it looks like it's quite easy. I just wondered, first-hand experience, can you give me a description what it's really like to turn that wheel? And while I'm on the mic, if there's an opportunity to view those films that you showed or film, I wasn't quite sure if it was one or several. If they're available for a wider audience, I'd love to watch the whole thing. But anyway, that's my question.
Absolutely, thanks, Gareth. No, so first of all, they're all 3 available, so I'm very happy to share them. They're all on YouTube, so I can put them in the chat later on. So the force, yes, it depends, as most things, I guess. So it depends on the amount of pressure that you want to actually put on between the wheel and the bed. But generally, as you can see, you know, it's actually it's much more relevant how tall or how small you are, because you're doing it hand over head. And as long as you push in with your hip, and once you're in front of the press, you'll see it is actually relatively, I wouldn't say easy, but you can do it without, you know, having to go through, you know, some training, or, you know, I certainly don't exercise regularly, so, you know. Now, to do it well and to do it that, you know, in a way that is as precise and as even as you want it to be, that obviously is a different sort of level. And it also depends on how often you do it. So what I do with the students is to at least do one impression. But you can do obviously 2 or 3 impressions depending on how you've inked the plate. So, but even after 3, if you do them straight one after another, the students tire relatively quickly, and then you realize, oh well, if you were to do this for, a couple of hours, and you'd have to do it in a very, very precise manner, then it becomes a different thing. But I should also say, you're all of you, very, very welcome to come to Houston to try out all of this for yourselves. There is really and this is not just rhetorical, that is a truly felt and invitation.
That's very good to know, because there are 2 comments or questions in the chat. Whether the tool, the press.
Sibylla, just because it's under my name, but it's actually my wife next door. As a printmaker and librarian, are there any plans for a printmaker and artist in residence? And when you said Alexandra about coming to visit and that it's open, I just had a cheer from next door. So she was very pleased by that news.
So that's definitely something to ponder. And there was another question by Diane, who is an artist, and she asked whether the press is going to go on tour at any point. Diane, maybe you want to say something about your question. I see that you've unmuted yourself.
Hi, Sibylla. Yeah, it's just because I want to use it. So yeah, it's either I'm coming to it, or is it coming to me? Because I also trained in printmaking, and I've only ever used metal press. So I'm very interested to know what a wooden press would feel like, and the difference in the printmaking process. So yeah, I'm quite intrigued by that.
It's quite different, yes. I would say that probably you will have to come to it, just simply because it was such. I mean, we were lucky also. So was mentioning one thing is the timing, and getting the funds and the organization, but putting the thing together was not an easy feat at all. And really required very, very precise instructions from the carpenters and so on. And Michael and I were, let's just say that there were certain moments where we had to think really hard and make sure not, to not to do any damage. So I don't think it is something that we can easily move around. But the plans of having somebody yes, John Jordan was saying he's trying to do his best not to break it, because he's coming. So, and I hope you can attest to the fact that this was not a difficult thing. That folks here are really welcoming, really, for that, for you to visit.
Okay, I can see that Camilla has her hand up. Camilla, please. Oh, we can't hear you.
Okay, so thank you for the brilliant presentation. I was very, very impressed also by how you put all this together. And I just wonder, in terms of availability, so if the press is available for students at certain times of the year, and how is the process of making an appointment to use it? How does it work?
So the very simple answer is, as long as you book an appointment, it's always available, whether you're a student, a graduate student, a visiting staff. As I said, all of these people have actually used the press. These are not just fantasies that I had. If you're from within Rice or within Houston, that's easier, because you just get in touch with Amanda Foki, the head of the special collections, and I'm going to put her name up here. and I told her that I would do this maybe, so she knows she's not gonna. That's her name. You can email her, and I think maybe whoever has had contact with her can attest that incredibly helpful. You can always email me. I'm always very happy to pass on. I'm not so much the steward, or there's nobody guarding the press, as it were. People are looking after it, and generally the center is open Monday to Friday. During the day, and as long as people book an appointment, and then it depends on what they want to do with the press. If we do it with the students, or students want to do it themselves, or as a printing studio, then sometimes we print with the plates that were provided by Michael. Some people bring in their own plates. It depends on it also depends on what paper is, what kinds of paper people want to print on, the type of investment that they have in the, let's say, specificity of what they want to produce. But it's very, very open. They are very, as long as it is within sensible hours. The library, the staff at the research center try and make sure that when the press is booked, that there aren't that many other researchers around during that time. But it isn't really a problem. So there hasn't been anybody who has been, say, turned away for whatever reason. The idea is really to get this to use this as a research and teaching and self-teaching tool, really. Not have it as a museum piece standing there. That's one of the reasons why we put it right in the front. It's right in the front entrance of the library. So when people walk past, they see it used, they get intrigued, they come in, they have a conversation. And, Amanda, thankfully, has, infinite patience. So she is actually able to accommodate all of these requests.
And have people brought their own copper plates?
Yes.
Have people brought their own copper plates designed
the way?
Yeah?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. And I can see that John Reardon has raised his hand. John, can you appear, please?
I can't, I'm afraid. For some reason my video won't come on. I think I've been transformed into my icon since Alexander shared it, but that's fine. I can live with that. I look a bit younger than I do there in real life, so that's good. Yeah, I just wanted to attest to what Alexander was saying about how I haven't got there yet, obviously, but how unexpectedly easy it was to get in touch. And I just dropped Alexander an email. It was actually off the back of an article in the last issue of Vala that Roger Whitson wrote about using the press in Rice. And so I just sort of speculatively dropped dropped Roger an email and then Alexander an email, and didn't quite expect to hear back, really. But Alexander and Amanda have been incredibly gracious in inviting me to come. And yeah, my sort of main reason initially and remains is to sort of understand more about Blake's processes and to use the replica Michael Phillips plates. But I'm certainly trying to get some copper plates made at the moment of some designs which I'm hoping to sort of use as chapter designs, sort of chapter heading designs in my graphic novel about Blake that I'm doing. So I'm hopefully going to have a go at seeing how those turn out, and I'm very excited about doing this. One thing I wanted to ask as well, because probably someone here knows, I'm pretty sure I read somewhere, and I can't quite remember where in the various sort of Blake books around, that there is an account of Blake moving house at some point, and obviously the press then having to be disassembled and put back together. And I'm pretty sure I remember reading that it was almost like getting your piano tuned, like that you had to get the press guy to come in and sort of calibrate it and put it all back together. But I may have dreamt it, I don't know.
Does anyone want to speak to that?
I do know that I only know one detail, but that doesn't wouldn't work with the moving. It was the moving into the studio, where I think that was the reports about that were, and the blueprints that that Michael Phillips got together to figure out the dimensions of the exact press. I do know that, but the so about the moving, I did not know.
It might be an elaborate Blakean dream. I don't know.
It sounds probable. I'm dying. I can't see any hands, so because I'm dying to ask this question. Oh, sorry, you've just remembered something.
I just wanted to say in the chat, Jason asked about the blueprints for the press, whether they're online. They are not. But I don't see why not. I don't know. Interesting idea. As far as I know, anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Sybil.
So I'm dying to know your thoughts on how having a go at the press will change how we read Blake. And you hinted at the theoretical potential and how we approach the archive. So I'm just wondering whether you could elaborate on this a little bit more, because Blake wasn't just a poet, he engraved, he printed his works, and then there's also the images. So do you want to say a little bit more about this?
Sure. I mean, I think that it always depends on how, how deep you're into this already anyway. I'm not that deep into it. And so for me, it is really revealing to learn through the physical activity of engaging with these materials, something about how I will then later on, or simultaneously while I'm doing it, read the poetry, look at the art, think through the art. And that goes from everything from deciding on a color to how the climate around you will influence the way you daub. And after 2 hours, for instance, say, do you know what? No, I can't do it today. It's just not. This is it's too humid. This is it's a mess. And you get you have a very different kind of relation to the object, even if it's an object of study. Now, if I then extrapolate from that to imagining what it would have been like to have already produced this thing, then of course it becomes I think that's where the theoretical, it's in some way, it isn't theoretical with a big T, with a capital T. It's simply a theoretical in the sense that you realize that through the practice, you're actually learning an awful lot. Now, some people who've done this their entire lives, I think, know this in some way. But for students, or who for the most part, and for me, I mean, I got into Blake after my first book. I knew that this was sort of theoretically true, but I didn't really, I had no idea what it really, really meant. And now I realize that every time that I go, my relation to this practice changes, and how I read it. And then there are little things like the example that I gave about the lamb, right? The lamb, there's just, that helps me to read the poem differently. About, from Songs of Innocence and of Experience. It's a very simple thing in some way, right? But it allows me to open up when I read the poem differently. And that's for me a theoretical moment. But like the graduate student whose clip I played there, it's very, very one of the students in that graduate seminar on the labor of reading really thought through very, very hard about what it suddenly meant to read in the historical conditions, and how we think of reading as a particular form of, say, labor, right? Mm-hmm. We have great theories of writing as labor, but not so much. And then you suddenly think about daubing, and you suddenly think about, well, who purchases? I mean, then so again, these are very, very simple ways in which to open up this theoretical universe, but because they're so concrete, and you really have to deal with them on the page. They no, sorry, not on the page, but in situ. They make you think about this work very, very differently.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There's 2 comments in the chat, and I'm just going, because you mentioned
Laura,
the grease.
just off Thora's comment about the ink. I mean, when it's simple. Again, bone black. Well, if you're an eco-critic and you suddenly realize it's about real bones, then suddenly it opens up. This is nothing particular to Blake, right? But it opens up the way in which you read.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. There's one more hand, and Andy Wilson. Andy, can you show yourself?
Yeah. I've got video yet.
No, we can see a face, but not yours.
Okay, well, I'll ask the question anyway. I'm not sure it is really a question, but in terms of what people might have learned from, from doing all this, from doing the printing, what we might learn about Blake, I was really interested in when you talked about how the students got tired very quickly. And then you said, imagine what that would be like if you were doing this for long periods of time and you had to maintain the physical strength, you had to be constant, also concentration, things like that. And it just made me wonder, I wonder if, the way that Blake so often in his text reflects the printing process, he talks about it, reflects it and comments on it backwards and forwards in various ways. I was just wondering if that printing process must induce a very particular state of mind if you're doing it over a long period of time. And I just wondered, when I'm reading Blake again, I'll be just looking out for any reference to that, what it's like to, mentally to be sort of do that over an extended period of time.
Absolutely. And there are people in this virtual room who've written on this and with much more authority than I can, but I think that's definitely true. It's the same, and it's not just the force of the printing. I mean, I think the daubing gets short shrift. It takes an awful lot of time, and it's awful. I mean, you need some patience. It's meditative, and it is. You can sort of be quite positive about it and say, oh, it's meditative, but you can also be like one of the American commentators in the video says, it's quite a tedious process, and it is. So, all of those, the cleaning, the way in which you think about these activities, they relate immediately to the way in which this is, to the content of the poetry and also the form, actually. I mean, again, we all know this, but the size, of these plates matter greatly. And again, the nature of them, that they're so delicate on the one hand, but on the other hand, that when you start having to clean them with, then suddenly you realize that they're actually quite resistant, they're resistant.